The peaceful protests leading up to the violent period of conflict in Ireland are often cited as causing the violence.
However, analyzing individual accounts reveals that the response to the protests were the root of the escalation.
Hello, and welcome to our Facing History Final Project podcast. I'm Naya Puri.
I'm Nina Berry Lofthouse.
And I'm Phoebe English.
Today we will be discussing the Northern Irish civil rights protests that led up to the conflict known as the Troubles.
The Troubles were a period of conflict in Northern Ireland between the Irish Catholic nationalists and the Protestant loyalists. The Irish Republican Army, or IRA, saw the conflict as a war for independence, while the loyalist militias fought to stay under the rule of the United Kingdom. The loyalists were also supported by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, or RUC, a police force at the time, who had British influence and origin. At least 3,600 were killed and over 30,000 people were injured during the Troubles, which began in 1968. However, the tensions between these two groups began much earlier.
In the 12th century, the Anglo-Norman invasion brought the first British presence to Ireland. They continued to be a strong presence there for the succeeding centuries. The British colonizers displaced Irish landowners to build plantations, the most significant one being Ulster. Ulster became dominated by British settlers who did not assimilate with the Irish, thus began the Protestant ascendancy. After the Irish War of Independence from 1919 to 1921, the British divided Ireland into two powers, what we know today as the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. In 1922, Northern Ireland was 1/3 Catholic and 2/3 Protestant. As inequality between the Catholics and Protestants grew, so did the tension. Political and economic pursuits were in favor of Protestants. Catholics were pushed out of government and barriers were established to prevent them from voting. They faced harassment from the authorities and were discriminated against in regards to education and housing. Additionally, Irish culture was suppressed. They could not fly the Irish flag and their language and history were not taught in schools. Essentially, they were being ostracized from all aspects of society as there was a big division surrounding culture and politics. The system was designed to discriminate against Catholics and they felt there was no way out as Catholics were unable to lawfully prove their rights were being violated. To this day, many in Northern Ireland continue to feel the weight of the conflict as it is said that the emotional walls are certainly still there.
The Parliament of Northern Ireland passed the Education Act of 1947 that intended to allow equal opportunities for education, something Catholics were lacking at the time. This created a generation that had new expectations for more equitable treatment. With the rise of protest movements around the world in the 1960s, Northern Irish Catholics began their own civil rights groups, mainly the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. On October 5, 1968, the NICRA organized a protest and, in response, the Unionists decided to have a counter-protest. While many personal accounts suggest that the bloodshed came in response to the protests rather than because of them, historians still disagree on who initially prompted the violence. The RUC consistently sided with the Loyalists in various ways, such as failing to protect peaceful protesters from counter-protesters and civilians. They also stopped many demonstrations and responded to disobedience with open fire. The movement's violent escalation is seen as the beginnings of the Troubles.
The Northern Ireland border town was another scene of violence in a black weekend. What started as a peaceful civil rights march turned into a battlefield. Despite appeals by march leaders for no violence, trouble flared when steel-helmeted police saw to the marchers' route to exclude a Protestant area of the town. As a protest, the marchers refused to take the alternative route. It resulted first in deadlock, then violence.
Riots and bombings became much more frequent in the 1970s as both sides became more desperate for closure and victory. The conflict had lasting effects, even after the protesters' demands were met. While there are laws against discrimination of Catholics, the Northern Irish still feel there are social barriers standing today.
Ultimately, not a lot of legislative change was accomplished due to the peaceful protests. The broader movement, encompassing many issues and demographics, was the closest the protesters came to achieving a moderate solution. However, the violent reaction to the Belfast to Derry March crushed these efforts. The New Year's March from Belfast to Derry, led by the People's Democratic Party, was modeled directly after Martin Luther King's Selma to Montgomery March. The Civil Rights Association in Ireland advised against this as the route crossed through many rural Protestant areas. Historian Paul Buse stated, "One could view the events of early 1969 as the real lost moment."
Eamon McCann, a journalist, author, and activist, witnessed the protests in Northern Ireland in 1969 and Bloody Sunday in 1972. He described a new level of segregation for the Catholics of Northern Ireland where the protesters felt disconnected from both their Protestant/loyalist counterparts and the rest of the European civil rights movements of the 1960s. He also emphasized the demonstrators felt aligned with the people of color in the US, specifically African Americans, and so they emulated the strategies used in the American civil rights movement. McCann also highlighted the use of the broad church mentality, meaning the movement included a large array of opinion and motive. This led to rifts within the movement. Some advocated for peacefully moderated conversations between both sides of the conflict, while the younger left-wing protesters grew impatient and formed the more militant People's Democratic Party. These tactics did not prove to be greatly effective as the protests resulted in little direct change.
While some opted for conversation or aggression, one female Catholic activist worked with a Protestant woman to start the Women Together Foundation to fight against violence in Ireland. Those in the Women Together movement were from both sides of the conflict, yet they were able to work together against the violence being committed by both the government and the IRA. Women Together not only helped create peace throughout the region, but also provided safety for Protestant and Catholic couples. What I find the most interesting about this account is the fact that the women were able to take themselves out of the situation in order to see the conflict with clear eyes. They stood for neither the government nor the violent activists, but rather for clear communication and peace.
Overall, there are many differences that can be seen when comparing the factual accounts to the personal regarding the 1969 civil rights movement in Ireland. The factual accounts emphasize a mutually prompted violent outbreak where there was no distinct initial aggressor. The first-hand accounts from the protesters are more emotionally charged and largely blame the loyalists for perpetuating the violence. When reflecting on the personal narratives, there's a difference in the emphasis of emotions versus facts, and we can see the true impact of the violence on the Catholic protesters. The internal struggle in the civil rights movement led to the formation of the People's Democratic Party and the overall collapse of the more unified, broad movement. This is more clearly showcased in the personal accounts of the conflict from protesters.
21-year-old Bernadette Devlin was at the forefront of the protests as an activist and spokesperson for Catholics. Within a year, she was Britain's youngest member of parliament.
If I thought it would bring justice to the people of this country, I would be quite prepared to give my life. The only thing is that in the present situation, because the Unionist Party is not prepared to do anything, quite a few of us may give our lives for nothing.
The oppression of Catholics in Northern Ireland was deep-rooted and systemic. The civil rights inequalities they faced mirror the Black Lives Matter movement and the historic oppression faced by Black Americans. As of June 2020, many Americans are protesting the treatment of Black Americans, specifically in relation to police violence. This can be connected to the civil rights protests in Northern Ireland in many ways. For example, the RUC consistently sided with the Loyalists in various ways, such as failing to protect peaceful protesters from Loyalist counter-protesters and civilians. They also stopped many demonstrations and responded to any disobedience with open fire. Today we can see similarly aggressive authority figures in modern Black Lives Matter protests, as the National Guard has shown excessive force with the use of tear gas and rubber bullets. Irish civil rights activist Rory McShane said, "When we saw the police laying onto marchers, it was as if something hidden and hateful had been pushed into the open." This mirrors the experience described by many Black Americans today.
When looking at the Northern Irish protests in 2020, we can shift perspectives and give value to the narrative of the oppressed. In the past, the violence in Ireland was frequently accredited to the initial protests. We now can see that the bloodshed was perpetuated in response to the movement. When reflecting on fights against oppression, it is important to hold factual and personal accounts in equal esteem. The voices of Irish Catholics were stifled for 3 decades. We must not repeat the mistakes of the past and work to empower the activists of our present, regardless of the movement.
Once again, I'm Nina.
I am Phoebe.
I'm Naya.
This has been our Facing History Final Project.
Thanks for tuning in.